somewhere above 17,000 feet, where the air is so thin it burns your lungs with every breath, where the wind doesn't howl so much as scream. A British mountaineer named Eric Shipton knelt down in the snow in 1951 and stared at something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A footprint, not a bear print, not a human print, something in between, and something far, far larger than either. He photographed it. He measured it. He had no explanation for it. And that photograph, that single, inexplicable photograph, unleashed a global obsession that has never truly ended. We are going all the way in. We are climbing into the coldest, most hostile mountain range on Earth. We are digging into centuries of folklore, eyewitness accounts, scientific expeditions, DNA studies, spiritual beliefs, and unsolved mysteries. Because the Yeti is not just a cryptid. The Yeti is a doorway into questions that cut straight to the heart of what we know about this planet and what might still be hiding on it. Buckle up. This is going to be a long climb. Before we talk about the creature, we need to talk about the place. Because the Himalayas are not just mountains, they are a different dimension. The Himalayan range stretches across 5 countries: India, Nepal, Bhutan, Tibet, and Pakistan, spanning over 2,400 kilometers. It contains 14 peaks above 8,000 meters, including Everest, the highest point on the surface of this planet. The word Himalaya itself comes from Sanskrit, Hima, meaning snow, Alaya, meaning abode, the abode of snow. Now here's what most people don't fully appreciate about this place. The Himalayas are vast in a way that is genuinely difficult to comprehend from a map or a photograph. The total area of the Himalayan ecosystem, including the valleys, subalpine zones, glaciers, and high-altitude plateaus, is approximately 600,000 square kilometers. That is larger than the entire country of France. And enormous portions of it have never been properly explored by scientists. There are valleys that have seen almost no human foot traffic. There are glacier systems that have never been mapped. There are ecosystems, entire ecosystems, that remain essentially unknown to modern biology. So before anyone says, how could a large primate-like creature survive up there without being discovered, I want you to sit with those numbers for a moment. 600,000 square kilometers, largely unexplored, at altitude, in terrain that is actively, aggressively hostile to human survival. If something wanted to not be found, this would be the address. The story of the Yeti doesn't begin with Western explorers. It doesn't begin with photographs or newspaper headlines. It begins thousands of years before any of that. In the oral traditions, the sacred texts, and the lived experience of the people who actually call the Himalayas home. The Sherpas, the ethnic group indigenous to the high-altitude regions of Nepal and Tibet, have known about the Yeti for as long as their culture has existed. To them, it is not a legend. It is not a campfire story. It is simply a fact of mountain life, the same way the snow leopard is a fact, the same way the glaciers are a fact. In the Sherpa language, the creature is called Yeti, roughly translating to that thing. Some linguists and anthropologists suggest the term derives from a more specific phrase meaning rock bear or wild man of the rocks. The exact etymology is debated, but the point is this. The Sherpas have a specific word for this creature. They did not borrow it from Western explorers. They did not need to be told it existed. It already existed in their world. In Tibetan Buddhist tradition, the Yeti occupies a unique spiritual space. It is described in ancient texts as a powerful, liminal being, something that exists at the boundary between the human world and the wild, sacred world of the high mountains. There are monasteries in Nepal and Tibet that have claimed for centuries to possess physical relics of the Yeti, bones, scalps, even preserved hands. We'll come back to these in detail later because some of them have actually been scientifically tested. In Dzongkha, the official language of Bhutan, the creature is called the Migoi, which translates most closely to strong man or wild man. The Bhutanese take it seriously enough that Migoi sightings are officially recorded by the government. Bhutan has designated the Sakteng Wildlife Sanctuary specifically, in part as a protected habitat for the Migoi. That is a real thing, a real government, real wildlife protection laws for a creature that the Western world calls mythological. Let that sink in. Sink. In the ancient Bon religion, the pre-Buddhist spiritual tradition of Tibet, one of the oldest continuously practiced religious traditions in the world, the Yeti appears as a divine figure connected to the sacred power of the mountains. The Bon texts describe a creature called the Dzute, a large, shaggy, powerful being that carries both physical menace and spiritual significance. Now, here is what I find deeply interesting about all of this ancient context. Across these different cultures, different languages, different religious frameworks, there is a consistency to the description that is striking. The creature is large, it is bipedal, it is covered in dark or reddish hair. It moves through extreme terrain with ease. It is powerful and dangerous when provoked, and it is almost always associated with the highest, most remote, most sacred regions of the mountains. This is not one culture telling one story. This is multiple independent civilizations, separated by geography and language, arriving at remarkably similar descriptions over centuries. When that happens in mythology, it's usually worth asking a simple question. What if they were describing something real? For hundreds of years, these stories existed in the Himalayas and nowhere else. The Western world was simply unaware. But then came the age of Himalayan exploration, and everything changed. The British Empire's obsession with conquering Everest in the early 20th century sent wave after wave of mountaineers, surveyors, and soldiers into the Himalayan terrain. And many of them came back with stories. The earliest written Western account that historians point to comes from 1832, when B. H. Hodgson, a British resident in Nepal, wrote about local guides describing a large bipedal ape-like creature in the mountains. He dismissed it, wrote it off as a bear, moved on. But the account exists. Then, in 1889, Major L. A. Waddell, a British Army surgeon stationed in India, discovered large, human-like footprints in the snow while traveling through Sikkim. His guides told him immediately, "Yeti." The prints measured over 13 inches in length. He noted them carefully. He couldn't explain them. He wrote about them in a book published in 1899. The footprints, by the way, looked nothing like any known animal's tracks. But the event that truly launched the Yeti into Western consciousness, that was 1921. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Howard Berry was leading the first official British reconnaissance expedition to Everest, the one that would map routes for future summit attempts. At approximately 20,000 feet elevation, his team spotted dark figures moving across a distant snowfield. When they reached the area, they found enormous footprints in the snow, large, human-shaped, but far bigger than any humans. The local Sherpa guides looked at them and said, without hesitation, "Meto Kangmi." Roughly, man-beast snowman. The British press, when the expedition returned, somehow translated or mistranslated this as the Abominable Snowman, a phrase that would stick in Western imagination for the next century. The Abominable Snowman, it has a certain ring to it, doesn't it? There's fear in it, there's wonder, there's that electric mix of dread and fascination that makes humans pay attention. Whether or not the translation was accurate, the name was perfect for capturing the Western imagination. And capture it, it did. Throughout the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, reports from Himalayan expeditions accumulated. Footprints found at altitude, strange howling sounds in the night, sightings of large dark shapes moving through the snow. British climbers, Indian Army surveyors, mountaineers from across Europe, all coming back with pieces of the same puzzle. And then came 1951, and Eric Shipton. Eric Shipton was one of the most respected mountaineers of his generation. He was not a man prone to fantasy or exaggeration. He had climbed in the Himalayas repeatedly. He knew what bears looked like. He knew what human footprints looked like. He knew the terrain intimately. On November 8, 1951, while surveying a possible route up Everest with fellow climber Michael Ward, Shipton was crossing the Menlung Glacier at approximately 19,000 feet when they found them. A trail of enormous footprints, clearly bipedal, deeply imprinted in the snow, moving across the glacier in a perfectly steady, purposeful line. Each print was approximately 13 inches long and 8 inches wide. The prints showed a clear large toe, a smaller arrangement of other toes, and a distinctive shape that looked neither human nor bear. Shipton photographed the prints meticulously. He placed his ice axe next to them for scale. He followed the trail for roughly a mile before it disappeared into terrain too treacherous to follow. The photographs were developed, authenticated, and published worldwide. The world went absolutely mad. Here was credible evidence, not a local legend, not a second-hand story from a Sherpa guide, hard photographic evidence from a respected, experienced British mountaineer who had absolutely nothing to gain from fabrication and everything to lose. The debate that erupted in the scientific and popular press in the early 1950s was extraordinary. Some experts said it was clearly a langur monkey or some other known primate. Others said it was a bear, specifically a Himalayan brown bear, which is known to leave unusual tracks when it walks on its hind legs and the tracks melt and merge in the sun. Still others said the prints didn't match any known animal. Shipton himself, for the rest of his life, maintained that he did not know what made those prints. He never sensationalized it. He never claimed to have seen the creature itself. He simply said, "I found these tracks. I don't know what made them. Make of that what you will." That kind of careful, stubborn honesty from a man of his caliber was, in some ways, more compelling than any wild claim would have been. The 1950s and early 1960s were peak Yeti fever, and I mean that almost literally. It was a cultural phenomenon unlike almost anything before or since in the realm of unexplained creatures. Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay summited Everest in May 1953. When Hillary returned to civilization, reporters asked him about the Yeti almost as much as they asked about the summit. Hillary was cautious. He said there were stories, there were footprints, and he wasn't prepared to say the creature didn't exist. He'd come back later with a more skeptical position, but in 1953, even the conqueror of Everest wouldn't flatly deny the Yeti. That same year, newspapers around the world were running Yeti stories regularly. The Daily Mail, one of Britain's major newspapers, funded an entire expedition specifically to search for the Yeti, the 1954 Daily Mail expedition to the Himalayas. They brought zoologists, they brought photographers, they found tracks, they collected some unusual specimens. They came back with more questions than answers. The American side got into it too. In 1957 and 1958, wealthy Texas oilman Tom Slick, who had previously funded searches for the Loch Ness Monster, poured enormous resources into multiple Himalayan Yeti expeditions. These were serious, well-funded, scientifically oriented efforts. They collected hair samples, they cast footprint impressions in plaster, they interviewed hundreds of Sherpa and Tibetan witnesses. And then came the monasteries. Several ancient Buddhist monasteries in Nepal and Tibet claimed to possess physical relics of the Yeti, sacred objects they had maintained for generations. The most significant was the supposed Yeti scalp, kept at the Khomjung Monastery in the Solo Khumbu region of Nepal. In 1960, a joint expedition organized by Edmund Hillary and Marlin Perkins, yes, the television naturalist, actually secured permission to borrow this scalp and transport it to the West for scientific analysis. Labs in Paris, London, and Chicago examined the scalp. The conclusion was that it was made from the skin of a Himalayan serow, a kind of goat antelope that had been shaped and preserved. Not Yeti, not an unknown creature. Skeptics declared the case closed. True believers said the monasteries had the real relics hidden away and had given the expeditions fakes. The argument continues to this day. But here's what I think is actually the most interesting thing about this whole period: the sheer number of independent witnesses. Not folklore, not second-hand stories, direct eyewitness accounts from people who had nothing to gain and often had professional reputations to lose. Sherpas who had grown up in the mountains and knew every animal in the region. Climbers with decades of Himalayan experience. Military personnel, scientists, they all described roughly the same thing. Let's actually build a picture here, because the witness testimony, when you aggregate it across hundreds of accounts spanning more than a century, is remarkably consistent. The Yeti, as described by those who claim to have seen it, is bipedal. It walks on two legs, upright, like a human. It is covered in hair, most often described as dark brown, reddish brown, or grayish in color. The hair is long, shaggy, and dense enough to provide protection against extreme cold. The creature is large. Estimates in eyewitness accounts range from 6 feet to well over 8 feet tall. It is massively built, with a broad chest, heavy shoulders, and long arms relative to its body length. The face, in accounts where it is described, is both ape-like and oddly human. The head is often described as conical or slightly pointed at the top. The nose is broad and flat. The eyes are dark. The expression, in multiple accounts, is described as intelligent, not the blank expression of an animal, but something that registers awareness, something that evaluates you. The feet, based on the track evidence, are large and distinctly broad, more human in shape than a typical ape's, but far larger and with more spreading between the toes. The stride in the footprint trail suggests a creature that walks with enormous confidence and efficiency in high-altitude terrain. The smell. Multiple witnesses report a distinctive, powerful odor. Musty, strong, animal, but different from any animal they knew. And the sound. The vocalizations described in accounts include deep, resonant howling, something like a roar that echoes across glaciers, and, interestingly, a sound described by multiple Sherpa witnesses as something between a whistle and a growl. Nothing in the standard Himalayan wildlife catalog produces quite that combination. Now, I want to be careful here because I'm not asking you to simply believe these accounts. What I'm asking you to notice is the pattern. Independent witnesses across different countries, different decades, different cultural backgrounds arriving at overlapping descriptions. That pattern is worth examining seriously. I want to be honest with you here because I think you deserve that after everything we've covered together. I don't know if the Yeti exists as a living biological creature today. Nobody does. The honest position is not certainty in either direction. It is informed evidence respecting uncertainty. What I do believe, based on everything I've read and researched, the testimony is too consistent, too widespread, and too credible to be entirely fabricated or misperceived. Something has been generating these accounts for centuries across multiple independent cultures. Something left those footprints on the Menlung Glacier in 1951 that Eric Shipton couldn't explain. Something attacked those yaks in Mekermo in 1974. Whether that something is an undescribed primate, a surviving ancient bear subspecies, an as yet unclassified species, or something else entirely, I genuinely don't know. And I think that uncertainty, held honestly, is more interesting than any confident answer. Here is what the Yeti does that almost no other mystery manages to do. It makes the modern world feel unfinished. In an age where we have mapped the ocean floor and sent robots to Mars, the Yeti looks you in the eye from the side of a Himalayan glacier and says, "You don't know everything. You haven't found everything. The world is still larger than your knowledge of it." And I find that thrilling. Somewhere above 17,000 feet, where the air is so thin it burns your lungs with every breath, where the wind doesn't howl so much as scream, something walks, whether it is a bear with ancient genetics that science hasn't fully catalogued, whether it is a primate we thought was gone 100,000 years ago, whether it is something that has never had a scientific name because science has never been close enough to give it one, whether it exists in the space between the physical world and the sacred, where the Sherpas have always said it lives, I cannot tell you. What I can tell you is this: the Himalayas are still up there. 600,000 square kilometers of the most extreme, most beautiful, most forbidding terrain on this planet, largely unexplored, full of shadows and silence and snowfields that no human has ever crossed. And if you sit with that long enough, truly sit with it, you realize that the question isn't really whether the Yeti is real. The question is, are we brave enough and humble enough to admit that we might not be the only ones up there? Thank you for spending this time with me. If this video moved something in you, if it sent a chill down your spine, or made you look up at the sky and think, that's why we do this. Because the world is still full of wonder, and some of it has very large feet. I'll see you in the next one.